Good day to you and buenos dias. You know, one of the great authors and thinkers in the field of media criticism is a person by the name of Neil Postman. Have you heard that name before? I don't know if you have. He was a professor at New York University, and he wrote this book called Amusing Ourselves to Death. It's a very interesting title of a book, and the book basically makes the case that not just Americans, but people worldwide are spending so much time with entertainment that they are neglecting other parts of their life, their personal development, their relationships with other people, elevating their vocabulary, basically understanding the world and managing the world. We're spending our time entertaining ourselves. And I think it's a good time to introduce that idea as we proceed with our class. I mean, we're studying media from around the world, we're comparing media, but we're really focusing on entertainment media. And the country that we're studying today, Egypt, is another example of a country that is shifting more in media content away from serious political talk, documentary-oriented media, towards entertainment media, or media that are amusing ourselves. So we're taking on Egypt today. It's in a new region of the world now. We're moving away from Europe. We're moving over to the Middle East. It's an area of the world that I have no experience in, but I've studied quite a bit. And we're going to be focusing on Egypt. And like many countries in the Middle East, Egypt is subjected to the law of religion in the form of Islam, in the form of the Quran. The Quran is the main book for Islam, and the Quran is a much more comprehensive document than the Bible, people say, because it covers not just morality, but it covers also law, it covers systems of government, it covers dress, it covers food. There's a lot covered in the Quran. And most of the countries that are in the Middle East, with the exception of Israel, are focusing their media policy and regulation to comply with how the Quran and Islam is interpreted. So religion plays a big role in the content of media in terms of restricting it not to have those outside Western influences that are seen as corrupting, things like pornography or infidelity or drugs or violence. So these are the things that are restricted, not just in Egyptian media, but in Middle Eastern media across the country. So let's talk about Egypt in particular. It is, according to the authors, the entertainment leader in the Arab world. And of the media that are available, radio and TV are the most popular media in Egypt. And specifically, the content that is taking place on these is moving more in the direction of entertainment, as I mentioned earlier, and moving away from news and talk shows. Now let's take on individual media. We'll start with radio. Radio in Egypt is the largest and most reputable in the Arab region. And if you look at radio in Egypt, it's 86% Arabic. So that's the language that dominates radio. But the second language is English, coming in at 17%, and then French at 4%. That's the percentage of content that you can hear on radio. French is 4%, English 17%, and that does speak to colonialization, like we've seen in other parts of the world. Both England and France came through as part of their colonial empires through the Middle East. They stepped on Lebanon to get there, the tiny little country of Lebanon they stepped on, and then spread their colonialism across the Middle Eastern theater, as it is sometimes called. Radio, for most of its history in Europe and Egypt, was a tool of propaganda. It was designed to foment, in many ways. Foment it's got a lot of potential. That word, it means stirring things up, and it was designed to foment against Israel, which Egypt actually now has a peace treaty with, and also to foment against Western values, against these encroaching values like T-shirts that people are wearing in the United States and Britain that are not seen as fitting in with Islamic doctrine in Egypt. So for most of the history of radio, the content was mostly very serious, very political. And in fact, if you know about Egyptian history, I'm not saying that you should, not for this class, but you do know perhaps that it went through a very big revolution in the year 2011 where the president was deposed and then tried for crimes. And this revolution in 2011 is actually known as the Facebook Revolution, because legacy media would not allow dissenters to have a place to air their concerns, but Facebook would. And so a lot of people in Egypt got in touch by social media, not just Facebook, but other social media, and that's how they organized themselves to overthrow an entire government. So there's a lot of political turmoil, not just in Egypt, but in the entire Middle East. It's known as a region that does have an instability to it because of the clashes between civilizations, mostly Israel and other countries, although Syria is in there as well, Iran is in there as well, Iraq is in there as well. Iran, by the way, is not a Middle Eastern country. Some people think it is. It is not. It's a Persian company. They come from completely different background, Iranians. So what we've seen, though, in radio is the emergence of most stations were state-owned. We've seen that before in other countries. We've seen that in European countries. They were state-owned. The government had control over those radio stations. But there has been a relaxation, and more private stations have been licensed. But those private stations are allowed to air entertainment. So that's how many so-called conservative societies, I think you might call Egypt a conservative society when compared to the U.S. society. Most of those societies are, when they're releasing parts of the bandwidth to allow private establishment of radio stations, they're only allowing them to broadcast entertainment, nothing controversial, right? No political or other news. There's somebody at my door here. I'll be right back. Alrighty, you won't have noticed on the video, but two guys just arrived to repair my air conditioner. They have to climb way up on that roof up there to do it. It's very hot down here in Mexico. But that's not going to stop us from proceeding on to talk about television now in Egypt. And like we've seen in Europe, we see a similar pattern here. There are state-owned channels. We haven't seen state-owned channels in Europe, but we've seen more of a role by government in television, especially in establishing license fees and then funding television so that it doesn't have to rely on advertising. And we see another iteration of that in Egyptian television. There are two state-owned channels. Those are the only two terrestrial channels. They're both state-owned. They're not going to allow, at this point in their history, channels to be handed over to private influence because of the past revolutions and the past political turmoil that they've had in their country, including going back between socialism and capitalism. So there are two state channels. There are 6 local channels. And they have 2 regulatory bodies in Egypt. One is the Supreme Council for Media Regulation, the Supreme Council. And that council regulates radio and television broadcasters, whereas the National Press Council regulates newspapers. And let's just point out that that's not the same for many countries across the world. Most newspapers are actually not regulated across the world, including the United States. They're not regulated. If they're regulated, it's because they are regulating themselves. Like, you won't have newspapers printing profanity in the U.S., not because it's illegal, but because it's seen as unseemly. So the National Press Council, again, trying to regulate speech, make sure that there is no agitation that's going to cause political turmoil in the country. That's a big part of the way that Egyptian media are regulated. The 2 channels you can read in the chapter, the 2 TV channels that are the state-owned channels, you can read the content types that they offer. One has a specific genre that's broader. Channel 1 has more variety to it, and Channel 2 is more focused. Then there's this, I thought it was an interesting concept in Egypt. They have something called an Egyptian Media Production City. They call it a city. And it's a hub where people who are interested in producing media can come together to hire talent. Like, you need somebody who's really good at voiceovers with a particular type of voice, but you don't know somebody, you can go to this hub and find somebody. You need somebody who's really good at producing video in the field, who can go out and has the equipment, who can capture video in the field and then edit it in a truck. That's what the Egyptian Media Production City is for. And then also Egypt has its own satellite network. It's called NileSat, named after the Great Nile River, and NileSat is a satellite network. All right, let's talk now about drama. That is addressed by this chapter, a television drama. Most television drama, we could say in the United States, is revolving around, shall we say, interpersonal relations. It's mostly relations between people. And we can say that that's the case also for telenovelas. It's about social relations, romances, etc. One moment. All right, so how is drama different in Egypt? Most of the drama revolves around portraying social segmentation in the country, portraying these gulfs between people, between classes of citizens, between political movements and between political organizations. So what are the sort of the classic back and forth that goes on in drama, in television, is discussing authoritarianism and economic development. Authoritarianism is where you have a heavy hand and the ruler of the country has a lot more say in people's lives and in protecting the country from invasion. But also that's needed for economic development as well. And economic development sometimes flourishes under authoritarianism because competition is eliminated. So you have that, economic development and authoritarianism versus state autonomy and capitalism. Versus state autonomy and capitalism, whether the people of the state are free to make their own choices and to compete in the market through supply and demand. In addition to that theme in dramas on Egyptian television, we also have dramas from Turkey and India being watched very much. So we haven't talked about those countries at all. Most of you, and I would put myself in this category, find those countries to be about as foreign as they can be. They're so different from us, and most of us will not get the chance to travel to them, but they are producers of media content. Turkey and India and Egyptian media are bringing those in. Another area of content other than drama that's addressed by television is fashion. Yeah, fashion. The chapter highlights that the media are very much concerned in Egypt with fashion. There are big fashion magazines called Identity and the Cairo Scene. Cairo is the capital of Egypt. And this also led to the rise of a political movement, and maybe not the rise of a political movement, but it helped fuel the rise of a political movement called the Muslim Brotherhood. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's in opposition to the fashion. It's seen as sexualizing human beings. It's seen as unseemly. It is seen as vain. Those are values that are coming from Islam and coming from an Islamic perspective on media that can have Western tendencies, especially when you're addressing fashion. Moving on to movies now, cinema in Egypt is the oldest and it's still the largest today, even though as you read on in the chapter it's in decline. I was very interested to find out that filmmaking began in 1896 in Egypt. That's really amazing. So to continue on with movies in Egypt, in 1952 there was a revolution that brought into power a capitalist president, and what happened during that time was many of the actors who were in Egypt left for Lebanon. They were afraid of the new political setup that was going to be happening. And then the movie industry was also affected by the peace treaty that was signed with Israel. Egypt is one of the few countries in the Middle East that has a peace treaty with Israel. And what happened there was other Arab countries said, no, we're not going to accept Egyptian films. That is betrayal. You have signed a peace treaty with an enemy. And so you can see the repercussions for media industries when something as basic as peace between human beings is affected. So a lot of the film industry in Egypt was affected by the signing of that peace treaty. And the book doesn't state this, but it could be a factor behind why movie releases have declined in Egypt. In the year 2016, there were only 20 films released by Egyptian media. Let's move on to music now. Music, once again, has always been about political change. I mean, we're talking about a region of the world that has a tremendous history, right? Egypt has a tremendous history, but it's also a very inhospitable climate for much of the Middle East with a lot of desert. And so people are living in conditions that are very challenging, very trying. They live by the air conditioning. I'm able to get by without the air conditioning today, but you have to live by the air conditioning. And so music and other media have always been discussing about improving conditions and trying to get political stability in the country. And then there's this company that's in Egypt called the Art World, and this is a corporation that's been set up to distribute music, to put people, much like that city that we talked about a little while ago, as a hub. You have the Art World that's a hub. And you have the X Factor, the X Factor from the US. You have X Factor Arabia that's promoting music in Egypt. All right, unlike the other chapters, this chapter next talks about books. And, I talked about Egypt having a history. The very first book came out of Egypt. It was made on papyrus paper. That's kind of paper that comes from reeds like the base of these trees, or that reeds are kind of like bamboo, and you smash them into pulp and make paper. The very first book came out of Egypt. Today there are two types of publishers. And it's interesting how these publishers are divided into two types. You've got private enterprise publishers trying to make a profit, and then you've got publishing enterprise publishers, and those are nonprofit publishers for political change. Which takes us finally to the internet. And I was really amazed at how low of access Egyptians have to broadband in Egypt. 31%, that's it. 31% of people have access to broadband in Egypt. And yet, people are online. The average Egyptian is spending 23 hours a week online, which to me is nothing. I mean, the average American is probably spending 8 hours online throughout the day checking their phone. So 23 hours is very low, and that could be related to that low broadband access. Egypt has a healthy advertising market in the online world, but 45% of the advertising dollars are going to YouTube, a foreign company, right? So, the final comment I have about the internet is TV and other legacy media, just like other countries, they're struggling with the development of new social media. And what are they doing? They're having to use those platforms themselves. So TV stations are setting up their own YouTube channels to distribute their content. So there you have it. That's going to wrap up our discussion on Egypt. I hope you have a great day.